The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff.
The shocking terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, claimed the lives of nearly 3,000 people and injured nearly 4,500. In the days following the attacks, the U.S. Congress hastily created a compensation program for the victims and their families, with individual award amounts to be decided based largely on the income of the deceased or injured victim. Kenneth R. Feinberg, one of America's most prominent lawyers, was charged with administering the unprecedented program and finding a way to both fairly distribute the awards and to discourage victims from suing the airlines or the government. He joins us now to discuss the extraordinarily difficult decisions he faced and the lessons he learned as Special Master of the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund, and to discuss his book about the experience, entitled What is Life Worth? The Unprecedented Effort to Compensate the Victims of 9/11. And now, the host of Policy Watch, Doug Besheroff.
Kenneth Feinberg, welcome to Policy Watch and the University of Maryland.
Thank you.
We are delighted to have you here. You're best known as the Special Master for the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund, and now you're the Wall Street Czar. Let's talk about the September 11th Compensation Fund and your experience there. But first, I did some research about you, and I think folks would like to know that you originally didn't plan on going into the law, and that you had quite an acting career, at least it started that way in college?
That's right. I thought in college that I'd go to Hollywood. But my father gave me some wise advice, saying that most Hollywood actors are waiting on tables, starving to death, and that why not take your acting skills and become a lawyer and go to the courtroom. And I listened to my father, and that's exactly what I did.
So I read the exact quote that you put in your book: you can play Hamlet in front of juries. Well, I think America is better off that you decided to play Hamlet in front of juries. After law school, you clerked for the chief judge in New York, and then you were U.S. attorney, and then you came to Washington, and you worked for Senator Ted Kennedy.
That's correct.
Who passed away this year. Tell us a little bit about him.
Senator Kennedy is a historical figure. It was an incredible experience working for Senator Kennedy, who was determined every day to try and improve the health and the safety of the American people. And working with him in the public policy arena was absolutely rewarding, fascinating. I tell my children all about those days.
Let's talk about the September 11th Fund. And I was deeply moved by your descriptions of it in your book, What's a Life Worth? The Unprecedented Effort to Compensate the Victims of September 11th. Let me read a few key facts. I won't hold you to the numbers. I wrote them down, and then we'll proceed. The number of claims for deceased victims, 2,880. The number of claims for injured victims, 2,680. Total awards issued, 5,560. Total amount issued, over $7 billion. The average award, about $1.2 or $1.3 million. That's for both the deceased and just the injured. The highest award, $8.5 million, and the lowest award, $500. We won't go there. You've said that the September 11th Fund was an afterthought. Tell us about that.
Congress passed a law creating the fund in record time, a couple of days, and it resulted in the last minute from legislation that was designed to save the airlines from bankruptcy. the airlines came running to Congress saying that as a result of 9/11, nobody would be willing to fly on domestic airline carriers. And they were very concerned that there would be major lawsuits filed as a result of 9/11. So it was the airlines that brought to Congress's attention, can we create an alternative to the tort system so that we'll divert people from litigating against the airlines, and instead let's offer them a tax-free public compensation program. When Congress decided to do that in order to save the airlines, Senator Schumer and others agreed, well, if we're going to save the airlines, we better do something for the victims. And the result was this very generous, unprecedented victim compensation fund.
Let's go back to the airlines just for a minute here. As I understand it, they were not so much worried about losing large amounts of money, although they might have from the litigation. They were more worried about the years of litigation and the kinds of allegations that might have been made. So this was as much about preventing the litigation as saving them cash money.
That's right. That's right. They weren't worried about their success in fending off these lawsuits. What really worried them was the mere filing of the lawsuits, the public attention to the lawsuits, the press, and the focus on the lawsuits. And that is why they were looking for some way to sort of blunt the likelihood of those lawsuits through an alternative compensation system.
So the compensation system is put into place, and the victims and their families have a choice. Sign up for the fund or take your chances in the litigation.
Purely voluntary, exactly right. You have a choice to make within a statutory time frame. Go ahead and sue and litigate for years, paying your lawyers, the uncertainty of litigation, or opt into this new fund where you will be paid promptly and quickly, tax-free, public money funded by the taxpayer, and isn't that a better way to go?
But probably less money than, if they had succeeded, than they might have hoped for in a tort suit.
Well, hope is a powerful lever in terms of what you hope to achieve. But the law made clear that the Victim Compensation Fund should be based on the tort system, that the funds that are awarded should somehow mirror what you would receive in tort litigation in United States courts.
Let's go back to that. But first, what I read was that of all the victims, all but 90 signed up for the fund.
Actually, of all the eligible claimants, that is correct. 94 people out of almost 3,000 decided to litigate. Everybody else, about 98%, came into the fund voluntarily.
And do you know, how did they do, those that decided to litigate?
All of those who litigated, I believe all of them by now, have settled. They never went to trial. They settled 6 years later, 7 years later. And I think when you deduct from their awards attorney's fees, attorney expenses, the time value of money, if you had invested what I awarded way back in 2002-03, I think they probably did better under the 9/11 fund, but we'll never know for sure because those settlements are sealed.
Some of the most moving passages in your book involve the people who couldn't bring themselves to sign, and you described that a little bit. Maybe you could tell the audience a little bit about some of those cases.
My biggest disappointment in administering the fund occurred when I was unable to get a few families to sign up for the fund because they were paralyzed by grief. I went to see one woman I went to her home in order to try and convince her that the statutory clock was ticking, that if she didn't sign up for the fund within a matter of days, she would be barred by the statute. And I met her in her house, and she said, Mr. Feinberg, you're here to get me to sign. I lost my son in the World Trade Center. And all you're doing is to tell me to sign up and get money for the death of my son? Please, leave the application on the kitchen table. I'll think about it. But frankly, no amount of money will bring my son back. And she never signed. She missed the deadline and was never eligible to collect the money. There weren't many cases. We were able to convince most people, even in grief, to take advantage of this fund and receiving $2, $3, $4 million. But in a few rare cases, I learned a lot about grief. Some people were so overcome by the loss of a loved one that they let the statute expire. They never litigated. They never came into the fund. They did nothing. They did nothing. And that was my biggest disappointment in administering the fund.
Yeah. Now, at the beginning, you had some rough going with the victims. I was surprised to learn that the statute provided for hearings and that you attended all of them. And what was a hearing? What did that mean?
We invited any family member who wanted to come and talk with me about compensation or about a loved one to sign up for a hearing. I conducted about 1,500 hearings. Wow. My colleagues, my staff conducted another 800. And family members had a choice. They didn't have to come and see me. Half the people never came to see me. They simply sent in the application and said, whatever I'm getting, compensation, thank you, please send me the money. The other half did sign up, did come to see me. And really, the purpose of the hearing was to allow them to vent.
Which they did.
Which they did, about life's unfairness. Why my wife? She was an angel. Why not me instead of her? She was on that airplane. She was at the Pentagon. She was at the World Trade Center. Why couldn't God have taken me instead of her? And then he'd proceed, as part of the hearing, to show me a videotape of their wedding 20 years earlier. This was my wife in happier times, Mr. Feinberg. She was an angel. I just wanted you to see what she was like in the earlier, happier days.
Because it wasn't just that they wanted to maximize the amount of money that you might award, but the way you describe it, they needed some closure and they needed some way of showing their love. In fact, the phrase you use is showing their love in these hearings.
That's absolutely right. It wasn't about compensation and it wasn't about greed. When they came to see me, they brought with them tapes, albums, ribbons, awards, certificates of good service. I had memorabilia that filled up my office, all presented to me by family members who wanted to use the hearing to validate the memory of a lost loved one. That was the real purpose of the hearing.
Yeah. And those tapes, just to make it clear to our audience, those were often the tapes of the last phone calls when the towers were burning.
One lady came to me and said, I want you to hear the phone tape of my husband trapped in the World Trade Center, calling to say goodbye. And I said, Mrs. Jones, you don't have to play that tape. That tape won't influence I want you to listen to what those murderers did. And she proceeded to play the audio tape of her screaming husband saying goodbye, trapped on the 103rd floor of the World Trade Center.
And there were also tapes of great heroism at the time. And I'm thinking of one that I think was played for you where the husband allowed other people to take the elevator first?
That's right. We had a couple of those where a husband would call on a cell phone saying, I'll get the next elevator, but I must make sure these employees go ahead of me and get to safety. Well, there wasn't a next elevator, and he died.
Now, I hate to ask this question, but was that kind of behavior, did that kind of behavior on individual cases affect the award you made in those cases?
No. No, this was an opportunity for people to present extraneous validation about a lost loved one. One woman came and said, I lost my son. He was 29. I want to play a tape of his bar mitzvah so you'll better understand what a wonderful boy he was. This had nothing really to do with compensation. I was required by the statute to be rather objective in my compensation decisions, consistent, without a showing of any bias, and I tried not to let the emotion of these individual hearings influence my compensation decisions.
I want to talk about those in a minute, but I was struck as someone who grew up in New York City about your description of the difference in the hearings between New York, Virginia, and California. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yes, there was a cultural difference. The New York claimants, and this is a gross generalization, but I did notice a pervasive difference.
I give you permission
The New York claimants were more aggressive, more in your face. I want my money. The Virginia claimants were largely service people from the Pentagon. Very respectful. Mr. Feinberg, thank you. I know it's a tough job, and I appreciate. And the California claimants were more collectively interested in prayer and thanks. Let's hold hands and say a prayer, and more community-wide in their approach to the fund. So whether I was in California, Virginia, or New York, I saw substantial differences in the general atmosphere of how people came to see me.
Let's talk about the amounts awarded and the formula. As you said, the statute instructs you to follow the tort law.
The law required me to take into account the economic circumstances of each claimant and their loved one. So, I want the banker's family not to sue under the law. Well, I better offer you the tort amount that is not available to the busboy or the waiter or the cop.
But you also played, I know you think the phrase Robin Hood is the wrong way to put it, but you have called it a safety valve. The statute gave you the authority to adjust the formula. And as I looked at the awards, whether you lowered the ones at the top or raised the ones at the bottom, the disparities were nothing like what they might have been in a court of law. You did something more than just apply a tort formula to those cases.
That's right. The law gave me that discretion, and I concluded that I better do something still consistent with the law to narrow the gap between the high-end awards and the low-end awards. I remember Senator Kennedy saying to me, Ken, when you administer this program, you better make sure that 10% of the families don't get 90% of the taxpayers' money. And I tried, consistent with the statute, to bring down some of the excessive amounts, bring up some of the lesser amounts so that although they weren't the same, the gap was somewhat narrowed.
Yeah, but you just put that in terms of the practicality of getting people to agree to be under the fund. But as I read this book and the title, What is Life Worth?, I think there was more involved. I think you were adding an ethical or normative view to what you were doing.
One thing I learned, all the money in the world couldn't assuage the emotional loss, the personal angst. All I could do is provide these families, these victims, with one less thing to worry about, the financial aspect of their loss.
And you also did that, again, in a way a little bit around the tort law, and I don't mean that in a disrespectful way at all, in dealing with the strictures of the tort law about married people as opposed to engaged people, people in a same-sex relationship. Tell us about that.
The law required me to follow state law, New York, Virginia, Massachusetts, California, when it came to determining who's eligible to file under the fund. Now, back in 2002, 3, and 4, fiancés had no right to the victim's estate. Same-sex partners had no right to the victim's estate. And when it came time to decide who's eligible, and I was met with objection, Mr. Feinberg, I was the fiancé of the victim. We were going to be married September 12th. I should be able to recover under the fund. Biological parents of the victim, what do you say to that? That marriage was never going to take place. So I tried to come up with a formula or a set of circumstances where I could convince the biological parents to give a portion of the award to the fiancé. And in almost every case, I succeeded in doing that.
Did that require you to increase the award a little bit?
I tried different mechanisms to make peace among competing claimants.
Before we close, and this has been a great interview, but it's been moving fast. I think you think that while this fund was appropriate at the time, we shouldn't do it again. First, why do you think it was appropriate at the time?
It was an unprecedented response by the American people to a unique historical event, rivaled only in American history by the Civil War, Pearl Harbor, the assassination of President Kennedy. And at the time, even though it was an afterthought, I think Congress and the American people wanted to demonstrate their social cohesion, their collegiality, their uniform support for the victims. So I think in response to this horror in American history, it was absolutely the right thing to do, and it exhibited the best in the American character.
It is striking, though, as you've mentioned in your writings, that we didn't provide anything for the victims of the USS Cole, to the first bombing at the World Trade Center, or for that matter, to Katrina. So it does seem as if this might have been a one-time event, and one hopes that we don't have another attack where this might become an issue again.
It should be a one-time event. It should be. I mean, you should read some of my emails, Doug, that I got from others. Mr. Feinberg, my daughter died in Oklahoma City. Where's my check? Mr. Feinberg, my son saved 3 little girls from drowning in the Mississippi River, and then he died a hero. Where's my check? How do you justify carving out for very special treatment, very generous treatment, just these victims of life's unfairness? Now, I think, as I've said, it's justified, but I doubt very much that Congress will do anything like this again.
33 months you were special master, and you talked to more people in greater grief than most of us can imagine. It changed you. How did you change as a result?
Well, you'd have to ask my wife about that.
We might.
My children. I think I'm a better listener. I'm more empathetic to the victims of life's misfortune, I must say that. That's for others to explain, but I do think that I'm a better listener than I was before.
And I think you've said that you're also a little bit more fatalistic.
Very fatalistic. I'm convinced that it's probably a mistake to plan more than 2 weeks ahead. These people on 9/11, they left the breakfast table and said goodbye. I'll see you for lunch. I'll see you for dinner. A perfunctory kiss goodbye. Their loved ones never saw them again. They were incinerated. No bodies to bury. I think it is inevitable that something like 9/11 calls into question just how much you want to plan contingencies, because life has a way of throwing everybody sooner or later a curveball or two.
And that's a lesson that we all need to live by. Kenneth Feinberg, thank you so much for being with us at Policy Watch and the University of Maryland.
Thank you.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content.
The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.
We are PBS.